Good evening and a warm welcome to all to tonight's Anna Maria Kellen lecture, to be given by our Anna Maria Kellen Fellow, Peter Schmelz. It's always a pleasure to mention, well, actually both names, but in particular, if you forgive me, Peter, the first one, our very beloved member of the founding family of the American Academy. And as many of you will know, Anna Maria Arnhold Kellen grew up partly in this house, where politics and music were always mixed. And so there are many ways we try to honor her legacy, but tonight is actually especially meaningful. Peter's title, Listening Through the Iron Curtain, Musical Exchange Between Russia, Ukraine, and West Germany During the Cold War. Peter will be introduced by Professor Andrea Bergman, so I won't say anything more about Peter because Andrea will do that work. Let me say something about Andrea Bergman. She is Assistant Professor of Music at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she examines the political stakes of music making in the 20th and 21st centuries. She spent the past year in Berlin as a fellow at our friendly competition, the Wissenschaftskolleg, and has been working on a project called Fragile Sound, Quiet History, Music and Unofficial Media in Communist Poland. She earned her PhD at Harvard University and has had research support from the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Musicological Society, and a Fulbright Hays Fellowship. She is the author with Philip Bergman of Hans Eisler, In der Musik ist es anders, and the forthcoming Musical Solidarities, Political Action and Music in Late 20th Century Poland. We will, as usual, have a question and answer period following the lecture. As I often say, this really is an open discussion. We encourage you to ask questions. Please wait for the microphone. Please utter a series of sentences that actually have a question mark at the end of it. Please also tell us who you are, also for the sake of the archives, which we all consider to be very important. And then after that, please join us outside for a friendly reception. So welcome again, and Andrea, you don't need this, right? You're clip.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Peter Schmelz this evening. Peter is Associate Professor of Music at Arizona State University. After he taught both at Washington University in St. Louis and SUNY Buffalo. But I think it's more meaningful for me to introduce Peter because I don't think of him so much as the Associate Professor of Music at Arizona State University, but as one of the most kind mentors and founding members of a whole sort of sub-discipline in musicology that insists that musicology is interdisciplinary and that links it with global discourses on Cold War music or Cold War studies. In fact, he is the founding member of the Cold War Music Study Group, but also I think you can see in his publications the ways he's constantly challenging this paradigm of thinking about Soviet music as Russian music and opening up Soviet music to global circulations. In this year of Russian Revolution festivities, and as a scholar of Polish music, I can tell you there's both latent jealousy at the busyness of the number of conferences on culture and Russia this year, but also clear relief. Peter's work is really remarkable because what he's done is really shift the conversation about music in Soviet culture toward the second half of the 20th century, and importantly, guided us young scholars toward using a range of interdisciplinary methodologies. In fact, one of the reasons, it sounds like I wrote this, but it's actually informal, which is really par for the course, because in Peter's first book, Such Freedom If Only Musical, he talks about behind closed doors, communities of intellectuals who pontificate as though everything they're saying is fact and truth, but in fact they're thinking through ethical positions, aesthetic values, and constantly changing. And so instead of these staid, triumphant, dissident notions of Soviet music culture, what we get from Peter's writing and his publications since this award-winning book is a sense of music always integrated with discourses on art history and politics, even if composers and performers weren't necessarily in conversation with those figures. We get a sense of people reading carefully and talking very seriously. And he draws on some of the most important anthropological studies on Soviet culture, but really makes a case for the importance of hearing music closely. And I think if I'm to intuit from some of his more recent publications and the title of this talk, one of the things we can expect him to guide us toward this evening is a really close relationship to musical texts, thinking about intimate music histories as ones that open up not just interpersonal relationships, building on, of course, scholarly interest in microhistory and the case study, but thinking about the aesthetics, representation, stylistic decisions that composers are making and what kinds of listening they were encouraging, not just in us as publics, but in their performers, but also the businessmen, so editors, and to some extent music critics and musicologists. I think I'll stop there, but I want to also plug both the piece about which his next book is written, which is Alfred Schnittke's Concerto Grosso No. 1, which if you're not familiar with it, I recommend. But also to say that that's another project that he has brewing while he's here at the American Academy this fall. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. I really appreciate you doing that, Andrea. Okay, I wanted to begin by thanking everyone here at the American Academy in Berlin for their help, support, advice, and encouragement over the past 2 months. I started making a list of the people who I wanted to thank, and I realized that that would be the talk if I did it. So I'm hoping that just a blanket thank you to everyone here will suffice. I really do mean thank you. I'm incredibly grateful for everything that everyone here has done for me and for my family. I want to begin by playing a pair of music examples to set the stage for the linkages I will be making tonight between music, politics, and geography, as I explore the musical exchanges between several important figures around, across, and behind the Iron Curtain during the early 1960s. First, I need to establish a base point. Let's listen to this composition for orchestra and chorus from 1959 by Georgy Sviridov. Oh, whoops, there we are, okay. This is his pathetic oratorio, which is not a great name in English. It's probably better to call it oratorio pathétique after Beethoven's example. It has all the hallmarks of socialist realist music from the period. It's bombastic, invigorating music, and it accompanied texts by an approved canonic poet, Vladimir Mayakovsky. It was recognized by the government. It received a Lenin Prize in 1960. And I want to give you just a flavor of the text here by reading from an English translation of it. It begins, "Rally the ranks into a march. Now's no time to quibble or browse. Silence, you orators. You have the floor, Comrade Mauser. Enough of living by laws that Adam and Eve have left. Hustle old history's horse. Left, left, left. Beat the squares with the tramp of rebels, higher rangers of haughty heads. We'll wash the world with a second deluge. Now's the hour whose coming it dreads." And in the key lines, "Songs are our weapons, our power of powers, our gold, our voices, just hear us sing."
Разворачивайтесь в марше! Словесное место кляузе! Тише, ораторы! Ваше слово, товарищ Маузер! Довольно жить законом, данным Адамом и Евой! Клячи истории загоним! Евой! 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 Площади! Выше горным голов гряда! Мы разливом второго потопа переводим миров города. Медленно лет карман, наш обед, сердце наш брат.
All right, that's probably enough of that. So I got 1917 into there one way or the other. Now, compare Svyridov's prize-winning composition to the following recording made in November 1961, I think, by German pianist Maria Bergman, who's pictured there. And I really like this title of her, this biography of her, which is called A Life for Music and Radio, but of course, in English, the word funk sounds quite different. So Bergman was a studio musician with Southwest German Radio and a specialist in difficult contemporary music. This is a recording of the movement called Signs, or Znaki, from the piano composition Triad, written by Ukrainian composer Valentin Sylvesterov in 1961, and made it, as I said, it appears that this recording that I'm about to play for you was made at Bavarian Radio, actually, not SWR. And this is a recording, as I said, of the piece Signs by Sylvesterov. I'm going to play the first 3 parts of it. They're very short fragments. It's comprised of 7 individual sub-movements. I'm going to play the first 3 for you. So that was number 1. That was number 2, now number 3. All right, number 3. And I should thank the staff at Kiel University for making these copies for me of these recordings, especially Tim Schwabedison, who went above and beyond in terms of copying materials and sending them to me. I thought I was going to have to make a trip to Kiel, and he brought Kiel to me, which was very nice of him. Saved me a lot of time and money. In every respect, these small piano compositions that we've just heard are the polar opposite of Svyridov's composition that we first heard. They're quiet and brief, reticent, not bombastic, cerebral, not emotional. Their language is indebted to the 12-tone technique pioneered by Arnold Schoenberg and especially his student Anton Webern, often referred to in Soviet criticism as Dodecaphony because of its fortuitous rhyme with cacophony. The rhyme works in Russian as well as it does in English. The genesis of this recording gets to the heart of what I want to discuss today. Performed by a German pianist, that is Bergman, for a West German radio station facilitated by a West German musicologist and journalist named Fred Prebagged, who had been sent the score by a Ukrainian conductor named Igor Blashkov on behalf of his friend Sylvesterov, who was, of course, as I've said, a Ukrainian composer. All of this was done without the approval or support of the Union of Composers of the Soviet Union or the Union of Composers of Ukraine, and only indirectly with the support of the West German government through its funding for radio. In my talk this evening, I explore further the idea of unofficial musical networks during the Cold War, particularly during the period from the late 1950s through the 1960s. I focus on 2 specific geographic areas, the Ukrainian SSR and West Germany, with the Russian SSR and the Soviet government it contained as another important node. That sounds like a lot to take on, but the story that I'm interested in telling is complicated. It follows the idea of entangled histories, or the histories of 2 countries that are wrapped up one with the other. As historian Michael David Fox writes in his introduction to a recent book of essays on Russian and German entangled histories from the First World War through the Second, entanglement is Not a simple borrowing or interaction, but persistent and deep-seated reactions to the other side. Not a simple borrowing or interaction, but persistent and deep-seated reaction to the other side. I want to build upon the work of David Fox and others, expanding it into the Cold War. As I do so by looking at the Ukrainian SSR, or the Soviet Socialist Republic, so the constituent part of Ukraine that was a sub-part of the whole Soviet Union, I also necessarily rub up against events today, and also recent scholarship that considers Ukraine and other Soviet successor states as post-colonial territory. So there are a fair amount of moving parts to the work that I'm outlining, and by necessity I often am following faint trails, since I want to explore the recondite, the previously obscure, and the less familiar, what I refer to as intimate histories. Official cultural exchanges during the Cold War have been researched in great detail by many excellent scholars, historians, and musicologists alike. Among many others, books by Penny von Eschen and Danielle Foster-Lucier on U.S. State Department-sponsored musical exchanges of jazz, classical, and folk musics have set a very high standard. Foster-Lucier, in particular, is well aware of the interactions and messaging that took place at the margins of official exchanges. I, by contrast, am interested in exchanges of information, scores, recordings, books, and related materials that occurred apart from official cultural exchanges. These are the types of interactions that have led me to think about intimate histories of the Cold War. Intimacy is an extremely salient adjective for the emotional resonances of the conflict, one that more than many others played out in the psyche. Imagining the imaginings of opponents, Soviets, Americans, and American Soviets, became a big business and suffused the art and culture of the day, highbrow, lowbrow, and middlebrow alike. In this project, I'm considering music to be an extremely potent messenger, a way of conveying information political, social, economic, and emotional. It became a tool used by individuals on all sides of the conflict. Tonight, we will look at and listen to a few of these individuals. The messaging at this time seems particularly quaint, analog traces that strike us in the digital age as slow, uncertain, and ambiguous. Messages that reached hundreds as opposed to the messages that reach millions, if not billions, today thanks to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. But these unofficial messengers and their unofficial messages from the past still have something to suggest to us about how art, and music in particular, conveys meaning, changing and shaping hearts and minds, serving purposes political as well as personal. My current research also refines my conclusions from my first book about the role played by unofficial music in Soviet society during the thaw of the 1960s, particularly concerning interpretations about resistance or dissidence at the time. I now think that I underplayed the dangers facing Soviet musicians, musicologists, and listeners. During the late 1990s, historians refined and reframed Soviet life, and I think this tendency has resulted in an excessive normalization of many areas of research, a tendency we still see in much scholarship on the USSR. Digging deeper into musical life in Kiev during the late Soviet period, I've begun to understand that things for some were much darker than the life in Moscow or Leningrad recounted by many of my informants. The periphery of the USSR often is touted as freer, particularly the Baltics, but this was not the case in Ukraine, as we will see tonight. So, like many Russian novels, we need to begin with a list of dramatis personae. And don't worry, this talk is not as long as a Russian novel. Many, if not most of the names I will discuss may be unfamiliar to you. We've already encountered some. Bergman, the German pianist, Prebagged, the German musicologist, West German, Blazhkov, the Ukrainian conductor, and Sylvester Roth, the composer. As I sketched out the network I need to trace in the course of the book, for which this talk is a brief entree, it quickly became very complicated. Tonight I want to discuss only a subset of that overall book-length network. So this is the bigger network here, right? So you see I've tried to divide things geographically. I didn't quite succeed, but it's, relatively speaking, they're more or less where they are on the globe. So in Moscow, there's a set of individuals. Ukraine, there's a set of people and institutions, and then we have things that are happening in Berlin. Detlef Goyovi, who is in several places, the journal Melos, and then Fred Preberg in Baden-Baden. So, I want to just talk about a few of these other people from the list I just showed you. So Maria Yudina was an incredibly important pianist in Moscow, and she had correspondence with seemingly everyone. She wrote to Stravinsky, she was writing to Stockhausen, she was writing to a number of figures in America and in Europe at the time, and she was a great facilitator for a lot of the networks that we're talking about. I can highly recommend her recordings of Bach's Goldberg variations and Beethoven's Eroica variations. They're phenomenal performances. Galina Mokreeva was a young Soviet musicologist. She was living in Kiev. She was married to Blashkov. We'll say a great deal about her later on. So this is the reduced network that I'm going to be talking about tonight. All right. The other names I haven't mentioned are Grigory Schneerson, who was a musicologist in Moscow, and Oksana Leontieva, who was a musicologist as well. Everyone else I think I've explained on there, or will explain in due course. So I'm going to focus my discussion tonight on a few archival documents that I've recently come across and the primary figures they are connected to: Sylvesterov and Blashkov, Prebagged and Schneerson, and Mokreeva and Blashkov. I want to consider what these documents suggest about the network of unofficial exchanges between these areas of the world at one of the peaks of the Cold War. I want to weigh what each individual involved in the network gained or lost through the exchange. I also ask what each moment tells us about the possibilities of understanding the relationships between the Ukrainian SSR, West Germany, and the Russian SSR, as well as the larger USSR for which it served as metonym, as both entangled histories and intimate histories. In what is widely acknowledged as a classic text on Russian and German international relations, his Russia and Germany, A Century of Conflict from 1965, Walter Lacour wrote, "The more I studied the period, the more I became convinced that diplomatic negotiations between these two countries were not really the most important aspect of Russian-German relations. It is my conviction that what Germans and Russians thought about each other, their civilizations, ways of life, and political systems, mattered much more in the long run than all the diplomatic reports." Lacour goes on to say that he looked at how ideological factors in the widest sense affected musical misunderstanding. Sorry, I said musical, didn't I? Mutual misunderstanding. That was an interesting slip. This idea of mutual misunderstanding is central to the relationships I am tracing, and central to the idea of intimate history as I understand and practice it now. My research on entanglement in the end shows how isolated individual actors were from one another. Each party engaged in their own, often divergent activities and suffered at times their own isolated, lonely consequences. So part one, there are three parts. Let's begin with Sylvesterov, a composer who benefited greatly from unofficial exchanges during the 1960s. But why and how he benefited says much about the nature of these exchanges and the assumptions of parties on all sides. How he eventually suffered as a result of those exchanges also tells us a great deal. Sylvesterov started out his compositional career fairly late. He graduated from the Kiev Conservatory as a graduate student only in 1964. So when Blashkov first shipped his scores abroad to Prebagged, Sylvesterov was still a student. I've already documented the exchanges between Blashkov and Prebagged. There's a longer article that I published in a volume edited by Jessica Ginau-Hecht on music and diplomatic history, and there's a short excerpt from that in this copy of the journal, which is out on the table out there if you want to read it. So I'm not going to be talking about what's in here, although I will touch on some of its events. By propagandizing Sylvesterov's music in West Germany, Prebagged performed a great service to him. As the Russian-born Dutch composer Guido Waldman wrote in 1963, he said, "We know next to nothing about the avant-garde music from the Soviet Union, and people like Waldman wanted to know more. They were sick of hearing the familiar music by Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and Khachaturian." So in a 1964 letter from Prebagged to the musicologist Lyudmila Polyakova, based in Russia, Prebagged mentioned his success in programming Sylvesterov's music in West Germany with some glee. And I quote, "Mr. Khrennikov, who was the head of the Soviet Union of Composers, Mr. Khrennikov will become angry when he discovers that 3 works by Sylvesterov will be premiered at the Berliner Festwochen this fall. None of them is completely mature, but they really signal that music is an international language. And for me, these pieces are an argument against many, many people here who constantly speak and write about the cruel artistic dictatorship in the USSR. So long as there are people like Sylvesterov, this chatter seems implausible. I believe that Khrennikov himself must realize this. Or is he so naive as to believe that in the West, a Lenin oratorio will be premiered one of these days? And shortly thereafter, Prebagged also mentioned Sviridov's pathetic oratorio, which is why I started with that, because it was part of the things that Prebagged was reacting to. And so one of the pieces that premiered at the Berliner Festwochen in 1964, one of the pieces that Prebagged was so happy about was this Quartetto Piccolo for string quartet by Sylvester Roth from 1961. And so I think this recording is actually from one of those performances. So if that's true, it's from this performance in September of 1964. So I won't say anything more about it. You'll understand when I start playing it.
Sie hören jetzt, gespielt vom Droitz-Quartett, die Uraufführung des 1961 entstandenen, aber aus mancherlei Gründen bisher noch nicht bekannt gewordenen Quartetto Piccolo von Valentin Sylvestrov.
That's about half of it, but I'll stop it there in the interest of time. That was the most Bartok-like music that he ever wrote at the very beginning of that piece. And then it kind of segues into Webern a little bit. On the Soviet side, or at least for now the Ukrainian side, it seems that the Union of Composers of the Ukrainian SSR was aware of the performances, or some of the performances of Sylvestrov's music abroad that Prebagged mentions. Recently, I came across an exceptional document, unlike any that I have seen from my studies of unofficial Soviet music during the 1960s through 1980s. This document, addressed to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, that is to the very top of the Ukrainian Republic's governing hierarchy, concerns the recent expulsion of Sylvestrov and his colleague Vitaly Godzatsky from the Ukrainian Union of Composers. Their expulsion was known to me, but the details had always remained unclear. This document traces the difficult road the two composers took to become members of the Union in the first place, noting that on 14 November 1968, their initial application to join the Union was rejected because their music did not fulfill the principles of partinist, or party ideology, and national expression in art. In December 1968, they asked to have the decision revisited. And so, a few months later, in July 1969, after listening again to their works, including by Sylvestrov, his piano quintet, and his piece Mystery for flute and percussion, the Ukrainian Union of Composers decided to accept both young men. But their membership was extremely short-lived, for as the report also announces, in October 1970, Sylvestrov and Godzatsky were expelled from the Union of Composers for unworthy behavior during the youth plenum of the Ukrainian Union of Composers. This letter and its accompanying documentation are remarkable for several reasons. They reveal to the extent to which the Soviet arts bureaucracy traced the creative work of young Soviet composers. Like any large organization, the Union of Composers in Ukraine was constantly reporting its activities to other layers of the government. Among these reports were official publications detailing the compositions written by members of the Union of Composers in various genres. Based on the archival documents I've examined, after a brief mention in 1962, when he was still a conservatory student, Sylvestrov's name appears not once in these lists meant for distribution and dissemination. Yet at this very time, many of his compositions were, thanks to Blaschkow and Prebagged and his associates in West Germany and elsewhere, receiving great accolades abroad. Sylvester Roth began composing larger compositions in the mid-1960s, in large part because Prebagged contended that they would sell better in West Germany and hence would be more attractive to music publishers and competition judges. Sylvester Roth's Symphony No. 3, Dodecaphony, it's a fantastic subtitle, from 1966 is a case in point. A huge, complex score for a very large orchestra. It was Sylvester Roth's submission for the highly prestigious Kusevitsky Prize in 1967. But in Ukraine, it was completely ignored, and pointedly so. So I want to give you just a sense of this. So there's no reason for him to have been writing a piece this big if he was not known abroad, because there's no way this could have been played in Ukraine at the time. And so here we have Bruno Maderna, a well-known conductor and composer, Italian, conducting this at Darmstadt in 1968. Played just the beginning of the third movement. So you get the point, right? There's a lot of quasi-improvisation, a lot of extended instrumental techniques going on. It's very different from the quartetto piccolo we heard just before, or from those quiet piano pieces. He's really kind of flexing his muscles there. The Ukrainian officials were well aware of what was going on, with a few notable gaps. Attached to the letter announcing the expulsion of Sylvester Roth and Godzyalski from the Ukrainian Union of Composers to the Central Committee was a list of both men's works. And so here, this is a transcription of the list. I've transcribed and translated it. And so this is the list they have and that they sent to the Central Committee, showing Sylvester Roth's pieces. And I've highlighted the ones in Berlin, right? So they knew what was going on. They knew that these pieces had been premiered abroad. And you like the fact that Projections was premiered in Indiana, right? It was in Bloomington in 1967. So they had their feelers out. They were keeping tabs. So as this list suggests, as do the recordings of Sylvester Roth's music in Prebagged's archive that we've heard, and also Sylvester Roth's correspondence, Sylvester Roth benefited greatly from the exchanges with Prebagged. His career started to take off in Europe. He also was able to hear his music performed live, if only on tape, something that was rare or impossible in Kiev, and only became feasible in the USSR at all because of Blaschkow's move to Leningrad, where he served as guest conductor under Yevgeny Ravinsky from 1963 to 1968, about which I'll have more to say in a few minutes. So in 1966, Sylvester Roth wrote a grateful letter to Maria Bergman, the pianist. You can see it here. He says, "Dear Mrs. Bergman, it is a long time since I have received the tape recording of your incomparable performance of my 5 pieces and signs, the Znaki we first heard. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Touched by your inspired piano playing, I have dedicated my triad to yourself. I remain yours truly, Valentin Sylvestrov." But Sylvestrov also had more immediate needs. A strange detail I discovered in his correspondence with Prebagged can be seen here. He asks Prebagged in this letter, probably from 1963 or 1964, for a mundane item seemingly unrelated to his composing, a piece for his curtain rods as he renovated his apartment. He keeps calling it a dinga, right? He doesn't know what it's called, but he knows that he wants it, and he draws a picture of it. That's the exact size. Well, that's not the exact size, but the size on the page is the exact size that he needs. And so he thought only Prebagged could help him with it because he thought it was a German part. And so this small detail, as I recently discovered, held important musical implications. Sylvester Roth apparently used curtains as a way to help dampen the sound in his apartment, both to keep his sounds in, but more importantly, to keep other sounds out. So this is a picture I took at the beginning of the month in Kiev. There was a marathon performance of Sylvester Roth's music, and outside of the performance hall, this was in a renovated factory away from the center of Kiev, and you can see the factory floor, the bricks there. There was an installation of different kinds of artworks, right? And so this is, if you can imagine it, is one wall of a prefab 4-meter square room, okay? And you can't see what's inside, but what's inside it is an upright piano, and a pianist named Mark Buloshnikov was inside playing some of Sylvesterov's pieces, right? So you could hear the music from the outside, but you couldn't see it. And those are Sylvesterov's curtains, apparently. And as one of the bystanders explained to me, this was meant to be a metaphor of Soviet life, often lived only in the confines of the kitchen or in other closed spaces. So thanks to Prebagged and other helpers, Blazhkov and Bergman chief among them, Sylvesterov was able for a time to break free within this enclosed space. All right, so part 2 of my talk. This is about Makareva and Blazhkov. This is a picture. Blazhkov is there. That's Blazhkov, that's Sylvesterov. This is Nicholas Leninsky, who was a well-known Russian lexicographer who moved to America and wrote a tremendous amount of books, but he toured to Kiev in 1962 under the auspices of the US State Department. I'm not going to talk about him beyond that, but it's an interesting picture. I thought I wanted to give you a sense of what these men looked like when they were quite young. They're in their early 20s. In November 1963, Prebagged wrote to Blazhkov, "My dear friend, please have some more patience, as I have so much work to do, mostly in connection with a campaign by people like A and CH against people who write about certain musical trends and think that the rest of the world is their enemy." So the initial A refers to Sergei Aksyuk, who was a Soviet party apparatchik, and the initial CH refers to Tikhon Khrennikov, a composer and longtime head of the Soviet Union of Composers, who I've already mentioned. Prebagged continues, "I hope you and our friends will not suffer on my behalf. I almost do not dare to write letters. Even correspondence can be interpreted wrongly. Moreover, several letters do not seem to have reached those to whom they were addressed." Prebagged's letter shocks because it came at the end of a very long year of repercussions and suffering by Blazhkov and his closest friends and family, as well as by Prebagged. At this point, Prebagged knew full well the danger of corresponding with Soviet citizens. Often the danger was known to his Soviet correspondents as well. Yet on all sides, the extent of these dangers usually only became clear too late. In the case of Galina Makareva, it is difficult to determine whether or to what degree she appreciated the risks she took in 1962 and after. Although she possessed only an undergraduate degree in musicology from the Kiev Conservatory and was denied admission as a graduate student, reportedly because she failed the Marxism section of the entrance exam, so clearly a pretense, Makareva continued to pursue her aesthetic inclinations despite their tendentious political connotations. She wrote an article for the Polish journal Ruch Muzyczny titled Letter from Kiev that appeared in the May 1962 issue, so over a year before the letter from Prebagged to Blazhkov that I just quoted. Makareva, then only 26 years old, took issue with contemporary Ukrainian music, official Ukrainian music, which she referred to as epigonous, dead, and helpless. Against these unsavory compositions, she juxtaposed the music she preferred, music by young composers such as Sylvesterov, whose piano quintet she called special attention to because of its great stylistic maturity. Now remember, in 1964, Prebagged had called Sylvesterov's early music not completely mature, so I found that an interesting juxtaposition. Makareva added, "Sylvesterov is a born dodecaphonist. He employs the system with great freedom. It is difficult to compare his present style with any of the well-known dodecaphonists." She's trying to make an important distinction there, right? He's writing 12-tone music, but it's okay, because he's not like Schoenberg. This was too much for Soviet, or at least Ukrainian, officialdom, for whom 12-tone composition remained a great foreign evil. According to a letter Blazhkov wrote to pianist Maria Yudina later in May 1962, because of this article, the Central Committee took action and immediately removed Galia and me from our jobs, so they were both fired. Blazhkov was in great despair. He said to Yudina, "My mood is such right now that I could hang myself." Despite losing her job, Makareva continued to give lectures, one of which she presented later that year at the Kiev House of Architects on 26 December 1962. The lecture was called, innocuously enough, Music of the 20th Century. Judging from the stenogram of a gathering of composers and musicologists at the Union of Composers in Kiev from 3 years later, December 29, the meeting at the House of Architects did not go well at all. According to reports, Makareva played examples of Impressionism, Stravinsky, and Bartók, but was poorly prepared. She did not present the proper ideological aesthetic evaluation of the works she discussed, one witness later said, meaning that she presented them too positively. Yet most troubling was the lack of respect that Makryeva and her advocates apparently gave the older conservatory professors in the audience. One professor recalled, "We asked a number of questions intending to properly direct the audience's attention, attempting to expand the discussion. We were unsuccessful. We were met with cries of dilettantes. For 40 years we have not heard real music, and now today we have heard it. Don't bother us." Generational conflict was not unheard of in Moscow in the 1950s at the Conservatory or at the Gnesin Institute, another leading musical school. But this degree of open hostility to official instructors is unusual, even unprecedented. The timing of Makryeva's talk was unfortunate. It followed speeches that Khrushchev and Aksyuk had made in Moscow earlier that month, taking aim at recent artistic developments, most notably a controversial exhibit of contemporary Soviet avant-garde art in the capital, but also the recent interest by Soviet composers and listeners to Dodecaphony and jazz. This gave the Union of Composers in Ukraine an immediate opportunity to apply Khrushchev's and Aksyuk's remarks to Makryeva. The stenogram of this discussion illustrates another key aspect of the entanglement I am tracing, the tension between center and periphery within the USSR. Frighteningly apparent today in the so-called static conflict on Ukrainians' eastern territory, a more muted but no less potent sense of pride and defensiveness about Ukrainian culture existed in the 1960s as well. First and foremost, Makryeva's activities reflected badly on Ukraine. Her Ukrainian critics cast her misdeeds in explicitly nationalistic terms, as composer Grigory Maiboroda did when he said, "How is it possible for a young musicologist brought up by the Kiev Conservatory and, by the way, the daughter of a Ukrainian writer, to be lacking basic feeling, not to say love, but simply national pride and a respect for the culture and traditions of her people?" And it's true, Makryeva's father was a writer. His name was Yuri Makryev, and he was a fiction writer, and he also wrote screenplays. Maiboroda also highlighted another entanglement, this time with Poland. According to popular opinion, he said, Comrade Makryeva is a professionally mature, capable musicologist. It is thus all the more regrettable that she, who grew up on her honest father's bread, who does not really know life, does not have any idea about the kinds of pain and agony in which our culture grew and strengthened, that she allows herself to replace it off in the corner with Polish avant-gardists. But Maiboroda wasn't finished. The unhealthy and, I would say, smirking interest in the history of Blaszczkow and Makryeva's collaboration, developed through certain foreign channels, and also by uninformed or simply cosmopolitan elements in Moscow, shows how a person who, it is possible subjectively, does not intend to do so, nonetheless provides grist for the mill of bourgeois propaganda. In other words, Maiboroda said, Blaszczkow and Makryeva, their critics at home, and their proponents abroad were only helping foreigners besmirch the USSR. This was another part of the Pasternak effect that Prebagged often mentioned in his writing to Blaszczkow. Criticizing an artistic figure in the USSR often led to renewed and reinvigorated foreign attention. Maiboroda said that he didn't understand how Blaszczkow, undeniably a capable man for whom we must fight, found himself in Moscow without any work. There an aura has been created around him, that he suffers for true art, having been tossed out of Ukraine by the local barbarians. And I've already said that this is what people who are not completely informed think. But we also know that this myth is spread precisely by proponents of Dodecaphony, modernism, or just simply by people, for some reason, having outsized claims on Ukrainian musical culture. The December 1962 meeting failed to solve the problem of Makryeva and Blaszczkow. Judging from a stenogram of a meeting at the Ukrainian Union of Composers 6 months later, in July 1963, the couple had continued to drive discussions, causing great consternation for rank-and-file members of the union. In his remarks in July, composer Konstantin Dankievich, a leading figure of Ukrainian music, was surprisingly aggressive, revealing the great emotions the issue raised among the union leadership in Ukraine, in Kiev. This was a moment when the local union appears to have gone above and beyond anything that was then occurring in Moscow, at least rhetorically. In terms of Makryeva, we didn't do anything. We haven't yet struck a blow, have not yet called her in, Dankievich said. And what would have happened to Makryeva during the cult of Stalin if she then would have allowed herself to write such an article? At this point, someone from the audience in the stenogram shouts, completely destroy her. They say Mokrye Miesta, which is perhaps a pun on Makryeva's name, but it means like we would destroy her. Dankievich continued, And not only with her, but also with her parents. And now we only talk about it. And remember how much her family and friends shriek at us over the phone, claiming that we are hounding her. Who is hounding Mokreeva? Who is hounding Blazhkov? They poison themselves with bourgeois modernism. We witness this self-poisoning among those representatives of the young generation who throw away all of the classical past, including classical harmony, as if all of it has already been used up. Then Dodecaphony pointedly accused a young composer he identified only as one of our most visible composers in the audience. Subsequent speakers suggested this was Sylvesterov. Dodecaphony's remarks are shocking. A leading musical figure advocating for a return to Stalinist-era punishments. This is in 1963. The claim was exceptional and ironic, for Dodecaphony's opera Bogdan Khmelnytsky from 1951 had been severely criticized at that time, under Stalin. Tikhon Khrennikov often claimed with pride that he had protected the membership of the Union of Composers of the USSR and saved them from the severe reprisals that had been meted out to writers and other arts figures during the 1940s and later. We know of similar figures in Moscow who upset official musical norms in the 1960s, chief among them composer Andrei Volkonsky. But we do not have evidence of such harsh language used about him. In Kiev, the story was obviously different. So now the musicologists. This is Prebagged's exchanges with Schneerson that I want to talk about. So here, this is Schneerson with Hans Eisler. This is Schneerson with Shostakovich and Glier. He was only a few years older than, or a few years younger than Shostakovich. So having seen the troubles that avant-garde music, and specifically propagandizing on its behalf abroad, brought to Mokreeva and Blazhkov in Kiev, we can now consider the other side of their entanglement. We know what the Ukrainian authorities thought of Sylvesterov's music, and to a limited extent, what Mokreeva heard in these scores. But what did Prebagged and his listeners get from hearing this music? Prebagged reveals a great deal about his preconceptions and interpretations in his correspondence with Blazhkov. But his concerns become amplified in his correspondence with Soviet journalist and musicologist Grigory Schneerson, author of the notorious book on music Living and Dead from 1960, in which Schneerson took direct aim at the contemporary Western avant-garde. Of course, that was the dead music. The Soviet music was the music that was living. With Schneerson, Prebagged strongly pushed the case for 12-tone music, connecting it to post-war German debates about denazification. In his letter to Schneerson from 8 November 1963, Prebagged laments his current position, stuck between two competing worldviews. Prebagged responded specifically to a prominent article by Russian musicologist Israel Nestyev that had appeared in the journal Sovetskaya Muzika earlier in the year, this is 1963. This article was called From the Position of the Cold War, and it really took direct aim at everything that Prebagged had been writing the previous year. Prebagged had written an article in Die Zeit in April 1963 called The New Music in the Soviet Union, and he had bookended that article with two articles in the London journal Survey. So he was really going out and talking about this music that the Soviet authorities didn't want him to talk about, so they took aim at him. Prebagged wasn't happy. He wrote to Schneerson, "Here the press has attacked me because I have presented communist propaganda, and then Mr. Aksyuk and Mr. Khrennikov have become upset because I write about 12-tone music in the USSR." Prebagged continued, "So long as the discussion about 12-tone music in the USSR will be conducted through arguments about art, then everything is in order. But treating these young composers as renegades and traitors, or to seek to socially isolate them like that is a failure, that for the USSR is politically impractical and undesirable. For then, one here can easily say, aha, government-controlled art. We know that Hitler also forbade 12-tone music." Prebagged then offered Schneerson some advice. Political pressure against a young man like Sylvesterov, for example, or also only the suggestion of political pressure to persuade him to stop composing 12-tone music would very obviously lead to the charge of artistic dictatorship. And I could not do anything to contradict that. This is why a Soviet musicologist should also research in depth the musical politics of Hitler and try to work out the fundamental differences between it and the musical politics of the USSR. Kind of a crazy sentence. Prebagged considered that, of course, that such an investigation would be fruitless. For him, the two types of musical politics were equivalent. They were both artistic dictatorship. He added, "You know that I only like a few 12-tone pieces, but as an anti-fascist citizen of the Bundesrepublik, there are seldom enough of such people. I can oppose no artistic direction that Hitler also fiercely opposed." Prebagged was so heated in his defense of Soviet 12-tone music, on artistic principles alone, as he often naively, if not disingenuously, emphasized, because of his own recent experience in West Germany. In 1956, Prebagged had been a defendant in a lawsuit initiated by a journalist named Hans Schnorr. Schnorr had sued Prebagged for defamation of character, citing as evidence a broadcast of Prebagged's on Southwest Radio in Baden-Baden, during which Prebagged had called Schnorr a National Socialist music critic. Schnorr lost the suit the following year, but these issues continued to haunt Prebagged. In this same 1963 letter to Schneerson that I have been citing, Prebagged also addressed a central question about the audience for new Soviet music in West Germany, which Prebagged counted as somewhere between 100 and 1,000 people, so not a lot. In his justification of such small numbers, Prebagged articulated several familiar arguments about the purpose of new, difficult music in post-war Germany. Yet perhaps nowhere else has this articulation so forcefully collided with the Soviet justifications for mass art. But, Prebagged writes, if we think seriously and humanistically, we must also countenance a small audience. Humanity, of course, is initially captured not by the millions, but individually. And also, do not forget that our masses think and feel differently than in the Soviet Union. Ours is a people, ein Volk, that elected Hitler and would, at a moment's notice, elect him again, as long as he wouldn't start another war. This people has contaminated our spiritual culture until the next century. In the year 2000, there will be a new people, no longer contaminated by guilt and false politics, I hope. Then perhaps it will be possible again to write for the great masses, and then it will be a rewarding task. It's amazing. Prebagged then asks Schneerson what he would think about publishing this very stimulating correspondence as a book in West Germany. It never happened. In an earlier letter from April 1963, Schneerson's own remarks on this topic suggest the utter collision of worldviews their stimulating exchange represented. Controlled art, Schneerson wrote? The term applies, of course, not to the controlling of the artist's brush or the composer's pen. The term applies to the ideological course of creation, to its role in the battle of the people for their present and future, namely the education of the young. After all, authentic innovation is always connected with these great humanistic goals, and all of that is not difficult to detect in the creations of the greatest painters, composers, and artists of the world of all time and of all peoples. That is why all the analogies with the Reichsmusikkammer are at root incorrect. That was barbaric, anti-human, a dark reaction, a tendency against humanity and his creations. Here in the USSR, there is a noble and huge concern for man, for his future, for his culture, a course for the good of millions and billions of people. So Schneerson's clearly playing the numbers game with Prebagged. Schneerson was offended by Prebagged's comparison and was certain that, at its heart, Soviet aesthetic doctrine differed drastically from that of Hitler and the Reichsmusikkammer. He argued passionately on behalf of Soviet musical aesthetics, as he did in many of his other publications. But why was Prebagged so interested in arguing with Schneerson, and vice versa, in their lengthy correspondence? Prebagged wanted confirmation of his suspicions about Soviet control of the arts, of which he was equally certain. But he was also looking to the Soviet Union for answers about what had happened in the 1930s and 1940s in Germany. Yet such answers were not forthcoming. And however much he felt drawn to the USSR and its music, and to individual figures in it, once he published his book on Soviet music in 1965, called Music in the Soviet Union, he began turning his attention to music during the Third Reich. So I'm going to bring everything to a close right now. Sylvester should have been more concerned about his career in Ukraine than his curtains. For by the end of the decade, as I mentioned in the first section of this talk, just after he finally had been admitted to the Union of Composers of Ukraine, he was summarily expelled. Both he and Godziatsky were reinstated a couple years later, but the damage had already been done. Sylvestrov's career as an official composer was effectively over. He was never employed at the conservatory in Kiev, and he led a marginal existence over the course of the 1970s and into the 1990s, when interest in his music abroad began to heat up, largely thanks to ECM Records' release of his music, particularly his large song cycle, Quiet Songs. So these are just a few of the covers of his music. ECM has released something like 14 CDs now that include pieces by him, either entirely devoted to him or including just one or two of his compositions. When I was in Kiev several weeks ago for Sylvestrov's 80th birthday celebrations, I saw numerous indications of his still marginal status there. I heard, for example, the Ukrainian premiere of his trio for flute, trumpet, and celeste, a work that he had dedicated to Prebagged, and that was first performed at the Berlin Festwochen in 1964. That this work remained unperformed in his home country for 53 years is a clear indication of Sylvester Roth's relationship to the Ukrainian musical establishment. I'm not going to play this now. If you really want to hear it, we can listen to it during the question period. So I also witnessed more subtle markers of Sylvester Roth's secondary status. So here, this is the Philharmonic in Kiev. You can see this is a poster advertising his performance, fairly modest. Kiev is actually very poor now because of the conflict with Russia. Evidence of that is all around. That's one demonstration of it. So this was the next day. This was on his actual birthday on September 30th. On the stage before the performance, you have the Minister of Culture of Ukraine here. You have the head of the Kiev Union of Composers. Yes, there still is a Union of Composers in Kiev. This is Sylvester Roth, and this is the head of the Kiev Conservatory. So there's Sylvester Roth and 3 people. Now, 3 days later, I went to a concert in the same hall for the composer Yevgeny Stankovich, who was 5 years younger than Sylvester Roth. It was his 75th birthday celebration. So I want to zoom in. So count the number of people on that stage, right? There were at least 12 people on the stage, right? And that's because Stankovich is the head of the composition faculty at the Kiev Conservatory, right? So all of his colleagues were there on the stage with him, giving him support. They gave him a painting, right? There were numerous flowers, right? So clearly he is someone who is well-respected and well-connected, and they showed up in force to show that, right? Sylvester had nothing like that at the time, right? Sure, they devoted the night to his music, which was great, and the Minister of Culture was there, but he didn't have the sheer, comradeship that this demonstrated. All right, this is another demonstration. A few years ago, Sofia Gubaidulina was offered an honorary professorship at the Kiev Conservatory. She accepted it, but when she got there, she found out that Sylvester Roth was not an honorary professor there. So she refused to appear until they gave him an honorary professorship. And so there he is now on the wall next to her. Okay, so there's these little slights that add up over time. As I mentioned already, by the time Sylvester Roth was expelled from the Union of Composers in 1970, Prebagged's interests had already drifted elsewhere. And you can see that from his bibliography. He had tried to help, but tastes, both his and others, changed. Political and social currents altered course. Prebagged delved further into his investigations of music under Nazism, and this arguably is where he made his greatest mark as a scholar. Life in the USSR remained obscure to him. Yet Prebagged continued to correspond with a number of Soviet musicians and scholars. The friendships had not been utilitarian. I want to end with a striking letter I've recently come across from musicologist Oksana Leontieva to Prebagged from September 1970, so just before Sylvester Roth had been expelled, or was expelled. Prebagged became acquainted with Leontieva in 1963 because of her work on German composers. She wrote a book about Karl Orff that was published in 1964. And in 1974, she co-authored a book on Paul Hindemith. So the two corresponded about, there was a lot of shop talk in that correspondence. A lot of things that Prebagged was correcting her on. Leontieva in 1970, so they'd known each other for 7 years now. In this letter, Leontieva tried to make Prebagged understand the country he had been writing about and engaging with for well over a decade at that point. Look how we live. Как мы живем, she said. We live on scraps. I spend a large amount of my time standing in lines at stores because of the lack of products. I myself take care of my family, prepare the food, wash the clothes, clean the apartment. There is no kind of hired hand. Our apartment consists of 2 rooms, 28 square meters for 3 people. My son literally runs us out of the house with his endless piano practicing. I dream of buying a home in the woods, but that is expensive and difficult. Leontieva continued. What does our spiritual sustenance consist of? We are among the exact same circle of people, sorry, this is hard to read. We are among the exact same circle of people like Yuli Daniel, Andrei Sinyavsky, Arkady Belinkov, who died in the USA, Pavel Litvinov, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, and Larisa Daniel Bogoraz, who demonstrated on Red Square against the invasion of Czechoslovakia. We may be arrested like they were. We read and think exactly like them. Our spiritual nourishment is unofficial Samizdat literature and foreign literature. I almost completely lack the opportunity to read in German. I don't have time for that. I read your books slowly, in excerpts. After all, I'm not able to manage even with my work at the Institute. And if I lose that job, then it will be impossible to live. Such are the lives and situations of many people in our country who support the so-called democratic movement, Leontьeva went on. There are very few of these people among musicians. This is a strong line. Musicians are narrow-minded, cowardly, and egocentric. Узкі, трусливі, egocentryczni. And I may add this about myself. I don't have a religious outlook, never joined the Communist Party, and will never participate in a new revolution. And then the gut punch. What will become of me? I don't know. Perhaps I await the same fate, as Galina Makareva, whom you mentioned in your book. Do you know that last year she hanged herself in Leningrad? Preberg probably didn't know this. Blaszczykov had been fired from his Leningrad conducting job just before Makareva committed suicide in 1968. He was more than distracted by his grief and by the chaos at the Ukrainian Union of Composers that ensued. He did not write to Preberg with the news until November 1971. Leontьeva concluded her 1970 letter by advising Preberg, write to me, yes, but be careful. Don't write about politics at all, and in particular about Soviet cultural politics, she said. But this information was too little too late. The damage had already been done. Sorry, I don't know. It's hard for me to get through that. I apologize. So this is Sylvester and Blaszczykov in 1975. They seem relatively content in this picture, but appearances can be deceiving. In both West Germany and the USSR, music, the right kind of advanced music, acted as a marker of freedom in the 1960s. Preberg wanted music, and this music in particular, to be a universal language, but it was always marked by local concerns and complex negotiations between self and other, intimacy and exhibitionism. As I detail in my forthcoming book, Sonic Overload, in the 1980s, Sylvester Roth began writing what he called postludes, a type of elegiac music that keeps ending. He believed that he was composing only the echoes of past music. But intimations of this style emerged already in the 1970s in his quiet songs. Denied a stage both in Europe and at home, Sylvester Roth turned inward and to the past. As familiarly postmodern as this seems, the interwoven histories I have narrated today suggests its exceptionalism, its shrouding layers of pathos. It was a sonic legacy of entangled relationships during complex political times. West Germans and Ukrainians and Russians, both under the Soviet umbrella, all grappled with their identities, wrestled with the meanings of music under political control, both past and present, and attempted to fit the ideas of others into their own systems, communicating the uncommunicable, comprehending only traces, fragments, glimmers. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions, and Peter's going to moderate himself.
Yeah, so questions. Yeah, it's difficult. It's different to read that on a page than to speak it aloud. I can tell you that. Yeah. Yeah, Kira. Oh, no, I don't have the mic.
Thank you. Kira Thurman, Anna Maria Kellen fellow, and professor at the University of Michigan. Would you mind talking a little more about how Preberg sort of came to know the music of Sylvester Roth to begin with, and also is the music, like, how is it being smuggled out of Kiev into, so that like people like Maria Bergman kind of can play it?
I think they just mailed it. That's my sense, that it wasn't even that surreptitious, that they just mailed it. I don't think it was anything as clandestine. That's one of the questions I have, is how they seem to be sending things abroad without any problem. I mean, sometimes in the correspondence with Preberg or Schneerson or Preberg or Blaszczykov, they talk about, oh, I sent you this book, oh, it must have gotten lost, or it was sent back to me, right? So sometimes it was confiscated at the border, but more often than not, it got through. And that's what I find really fascinating. Preberg, I'm forgetting the exact beginning of it. Preberg either wrote to Yudina or Yudina wrote to Blaszczykov about Preberg, but somehow they reached out to one another, and that was initiated. I think that Preberg might have heard about Yudina from Stockhausen. I think that there was a connection there because Yudina was already writing to Stockhausen, so they had that linkage. She wrote a tremendous amount of letters. There's at least 4 or 5 volumes, big, thick volumes of her published correspondence that you can read, and it's really fascinating. She was an astonishing woman. she was deeply religious, practiced her religion no matter what, and was interested in reaching out and playing as much new music as she possibly could, even though she knew that it would get her into trouble. Because for a time in the early 60s, she was not allowed to perform, but she wasn't allowed to perform because at some concert in Leningrad, she got up on the stage and started reciting poetry by Pasternak and other people that she shouldn't have been reciting. So this became a real kind of scandal because she made this. If she just played the music, it would have been okay, but she demonstrated something beyond that, and you weren't allowed to do that.
Peter, could you say something about the legacy of this music in current and future concert repertoires?
Yeah, I don't think
will it be played, and if so, will it be played with some kind of reference, with your help and other people's, with this kind of context that you're talking about?
I hope so. With that in mind, I think I started the answer too prematurely. I think that it would be good to perform some of this music. I mean, the concert, this is the other thing I didn't talk about in terms of the official and unofficial Sylvesterov. So the performances at the Philharmonic, they were fine, right? It's good to hear Sylvesterov's music live. But at this Sylvesterov marathon, which was run by a younger generation of musicians, it was clear that they had this deep reverence for his music, and they were really jazzed about it, right? They were really interested in what he could tell them. People who were brought up listening as much to rock music as to avant-garde music, it was clear that he had something to say to them about musical shape, about texture, about form, about identity. And so there was a real energy at those concerts that I won't forget soon. It was really interesting and absorbing to hear his early pieces, because a lot of the earlier compositions were played like the triad and the trio, right? Those pieces were performed in this warehouse atmosphere, and it was great. Yeah, so I think in that kind of context, there is definitely a future. Although I've heard through the grapevine that in Ukraine, there's also a debate now that Sylvesterov is doing harm to Ukrainian music, that he's too visible. And there's something about that that's stifling the next generation of composers. So I don't know. I went to the Kiev Conservatory. A professor there invited me to meet with a class of hers, right? And I just took questions and talked about, what it was like to be a musicologist in America, right? Sometimes not great, yeah? Like, they didn't want to hear that, right? Because it's not great being a musicologist in Kiev right now, I can tell you that. And one of the questions they asked me was like, do you think that Sylvesterov's music is Russian or Ukrainian? And I just thought, I don't know, right? What do you think, right? That's my job to... But it's that question, I mean, that's the kind of thinking that they're very much concerned with, at least this person was very much concerned with. And it's becoming more pronounced because of the conflict. I mean, I've heard about... families are being torn apart because their sympathies with Russia or Ukraine, and so this is a big deal. We don't hear about it as much in the news in America, right? And that's too bad, because it's happening. People are dying there, and this conflict is going on, and with no end in sight. Yeah.
Were there any other contacts in West Germany besides the one with Prebagged and Stockhausen, for instance, with Blacher?
Yeah.
And with Nicky Nabokov? Nicky Nabokov was the head of the Berliner Festwochen, the brother of Vladimir Nabokov. Right. And I was wondering that you didn't mention their names. That would be interesting to know.
Yes, no. I know of those names, and they're in the expanded network, the one that's even bigger than the one I showed you, the big one I showed you. Right, so Blocker comes up, right, he is a conduit as well, and there's a letter from Prebagged to Blaschko, is either Blaschko or Schneerson, I'm already forgetting, where he's talking about giving a score to Nabokov. So there were connections there. Goyovi is the one figure I really need to dig into, right? Because he was one of if not the leading experts on Soviet music in West Germany at the time, and I need to go to his Nachlass and dig into his correspondence. He was corresponding with a different set of people in Russia than Prebagged had been, so I'm hoping that will open up a whole other set of ideas of what. Well, and the advantage of Goyovi is Goyovi spoke Russian fluently. Prebagged did not. And so part of the problem with sorting through his correspondence is that there are letters in German and letters in Russian, and often the letters in German are the translations of the letters in Russian, but not always. So you have to figure out, oh, I've read this already. This is something I've seen already. So that, I think, was a limitation for him. That was a limitation for him in terms of his ability to really communicate with the Russians that he was talking about. But Goyovi didn't have that limitation. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. If you can think of any other names I should be looking at, I'd be grateful to hear them.
I'm Klaus Heiliger. you're working on your book on a work by Schnittke, and Schnittke didn't appear in your lecture now at all. Was there no connection?
Yeah, well, Schnittke, his name doesn't come up. He's corresponded with Blushkov a little bit, but that was mainly when Blushkov was in Leningrad and was getting some performances of music by his friends. So when Blushkov was in Leningrad from 63 to 68, and this is why he was fired in 68, was that he played a lot of scores by the younger composers in Moscow and in Tallinn in Estonia and in Kiev. And the powers that be, I mean, this went up to the Minister of Culture, Furtseva, at the end of the 60s. It got to be too much. It got to be too demonstrative. There was a little window there where Blushkov was able to do what he wanted to, but then it went away. And so that's the contact with Schnittke that I have. I mean, Schnittke was one of the reasons that I've turned my focus more to West Germany, obviously, because Schnittke had a very strong German connection. He emigrated here in 1990. Some of his works were performed at the Warsaw Autumn Festival, but he hasn't come up in West Germany yet. I'm looking for him, though. He's on my radar, obviously. I'm happy whenever I can talk about Schnittke.
Good evening. Nancy Grid is my name. Did I understand this, read this right? Sylvester wrote in English to this pianist, Bergman. It was good Where did he learn his languages?
I think Blushkov
in
did
German.
I think Blushkov did it for him. Blushkov's English is good, or at least it is now. At the time, he said that it was okay. So I assume that he had help from Blushkov with the English.
And then he wrote the German as well?
Yeah, he wrote the German, yeah. With that, his friend, the composer Hrabowski might have helped him, because Hrabowski got into some trouble because he was translating, what Eimert wrote a 12-tone textbook in the 60s, and Grabowski got a hold of that textbook and translated it into Russian, or into, I think it was into Russian, it might have been Ukrainian, but I think it was Russian. And so Hrabowski knew German, so they all helped one another. It's a funny letter, though. I love it because the English is always very innocent. Well, so is the German, too, right? There's this dinge. I need this dinge. What is this? Aglaya.
Peter, thanks so much for this really incredibly rich and moving presentation. And I also just want to say that I really appreciate the immense archival work that you do for this project, which is hard work, especially in that part of the world, and your immense sensitivity to these entangled and intimate histories, that take you through volumes of correspondence and working in different languages and trying to figure out if you'd already read the letter or not in a different tongue. But I wanted to ask you precisely also about this, about the place of text as history in your work, because it takes such an important role in your presentation, including that final absolutely heartbreaking letter. And I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about how that particularity of language and history comes into tension with what you, I think, referred to, following perhaps Prebagged, as this universal potential of sonic language and the universal potential of that legacy.
That's interesting, yeah. It's a very different project for me, and I didn't think I was going to stick with this group of people, right? But I came across Blushkov lives in Potsdam right now, right? He's 81 years old. He's in Potsdam. I tried to get him here, but he's not well. So earlier, a few years ago, Blushkov sent me his entire correspondence with Prebagged, right? And so I started reading through this, and I was like, oh wow, there's a story here, right? And I thought I had told that story. But then I realized that no, there's actually more to be said about this. There's more detail to tease out of it. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And so my first project, as Andrea alluded to, involved a lot of oral histories. I was interviewing a lot of people from the 1960s and 1970s about what life had been like there. Right, with Makareva, I have no idea, right? I don't know. I can't interview her, right? And I can't go. Once someone is at the end of their life, and not to be ageist in any way, but memories go, and so it's not as fresh as these texts. And so you're right, there is something about the text, but letters are insufficient on some level, right? Letters are different. The letters from the 1960s are very different from the email correspondence we have today, right? There is a texture, there is a nuance to the language. But capturing the tone of that Leontьeva letter at the end, I mean, it's very difficult, right? I'm not satisfied with that translation. I'm still trying to figure out how to get the right tone of what she's saying, right? Because it is this cry for help, right? And it's not clear that what Prebagged's response is, right? Whether he gets that, And I don't know, right? Because I could ask him, but he's passed away, right? So I think that maybe that's what you're talking about. There is this wall now that's gone up between me and the past in that respect. And yet I'm also very close to it, right? This is the problem, right? So I've met Sylvester Roth, right? I can't meet Schnittke. Schnittke is no longer alive. Right? I met Schnittke many years ago, but that was just in passing. It's easier to write about someone when you haven't met them. Right, it's very difficult to keep that objectivity that you want to try to maintain. I met Blaszczykow's son last night. Right, it's very difficult to. He's not Makreva's son. It's a son from a second marriage, but it's still right. It's a connection that's very difficult to erase. So there is a distance and an immediacy. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. That I'm still wrestling methodologically with how to do. And the stenograms, I find the stenograms just completely frustrating. I don't know if you've dealt with that. Right, you just have someone cry out this horrific thing. You're like, who said that? Right, was that a plant? Was someone planted in the audience to say that? Like, what is going on? And then there's all these other incidents that happened later. I had to cut from the paper because of length, but you want to know more about what happened, yeah. And I went into the archives hoping I would find more about what happened in 1963, right? What happened when they were fired after the publication of that article in the Polish journal? But there's nothing. There's just emptiness. So I don't. The question is, do I dig further, or is it just not there, right? And so that's also what I'm wrestling with. So thanks for the question. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Joseph Busso. I just wanted to say thank you very much for this wonderful talk. You mentioned Yevgeny Mravinsky very briefly in passing. Did he have any more connection with this whole story, or the whole? Because he was a very famous, probably the most famous conductor in Russia at the time. Did he have any other connections with this?
Not that I'm aware of. Only insofar as Blaszczykov was his assistant and was working with him. But that's a good question, because I need to look more into what he was thinking of Blaszczykov's activities. Up to now, my imagination is, this could be completely wrong, was that he just kind of tolerated it. Mravinsky was being Mravinsky, and Blaszczykov prepared the orchestra for certain concerts, and then he allowed Blaszczykov to do what he wanted on the side. But then when it became too visible, it was inconvenient, then he was let go. But I don't know. I'll have to put that on the list of things to dig into, yeah. I mean, there's interesting correspondence between Blaszczykov and Shostakovich, because Shostakovich conducted a lot of Blaszczykov conducted a lot of Shostakovich, but it's really just, in this measure you need to do this. It's very workaday. There's nothing really tangible there. Yeah, maybe one more. Yeah. Okay, two more.
Albrecht Riedmüller. Thank you very much. As you mentioned, Prebagged, who was a very difficult personality.
Oh, see, that's what I need to know. That's interesting, yeah.
Was not in the position to influence musical life or to make performances going. Mm-hmm. The same holds true for the local Maria Bergman in Baden-Baden. Mm-hmm. Now, conversely, Stockhausen had some friends and fans in the Soviet Union, such as the late eminent musicologist Yuri Holopov. Mm-hmm. But Holopov was not in the position to make concert live performances for Stockhausen going. Right. And I remember very well that as late as '86, I stood on Stockhausen's balcony, and he was very in Curtin, and he was very obsessed and disappointed that never ever a major work by him was performed in the Soviet Union. And disappointed as he was, he concluded, the Russians are not worth to listen to my music. Now my question, do you think that in all these fights, the fights of avant-garde against Prokofiev in Russia, the same in the West, of avant-garde against Hindemith and Orff, and conversely, the official musical life against the Western avant-garde and not against the Eastern avant-garde, they didn't take care of it. But in all these ongoing fights, to what percentage the Cold War spiced that?
Well, I mean, it depends on the conflict, but I think to a large extent it provoke that. I mean, that's one of the things that has become clearer and clearer to me, is that the Cold War was the water in which all of them were swimming, right? And they couldn't help but get wet, you know? So they needed to, the aesthetic educations they received were, to a large degree, influenced by what they thought of the other side, yeah? And so it's visible to me every time that Prebagged says, I'm just talking about purely musical interest, I have no political interest at all, but not only does it talk about politics, right? So this language about purely musical, it's tainted, right? It's colored as opposing what was going on in the Soviet Union when all music was political, right? It was unavoidable. That thing was connected. You couldn't have anything. There was no pure music in the 1960s or 1970s, or even now. There's no pure music right now, right? It's all colored to some extent by your identity, where you're hearing it, who's playing it, when it's being performed, that sort of thing. So I don't know if I can go into much more detail about that. I would hope that this talk demonstrates the way that it was implicated. Maybe Stockhouse was just jealous of Boulez. What do you think? Boulez had been performed. Boulez toured with the BBC Orchestra at the end of the 60s and had some of his works performed during that tour. So maybe he was jealous that they had picked up Boulez and not him.
Was that a tour in Russia? Or?
Yeah, it was in Russia. There's an LP of it. I have it. Got on eBay. Yeah. It was released by Melodia. Yeah. Debussy was on it. They performed Éclat by Boulez. I forget what the rest of the program was. So one more question.
Hi, my name is Frederica Brillenborg. Thank you for this fascinating lecture. I was just wondering, this is a little bit off the subject, but are there contemporary Ukrainian composers who have been affected by Sylvester Roth? Is there some kind of stylistic continuity or something, or is now everything so global and not so colored by the past of a certain country?
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in. Before I went to Kiev, I had thought I'd been looking at this guy named Shmurak, was this young Ukrainian composer who spends a lot of his time in St. Petersburg, it turns out. But when I asked the students about this, right, you learn a lot by asking students about what they're listening to, right? And they're like, oh, Shmurak, he's just a manager. All he does is he's a promoter, he's a self-promoter. So I guess that he's not a representative of that generation of Ukrainian composers. So I don't know the answer to your question. I'm still investigating that. I mean, there is a parallel between what Sylvester Roth was doing and what Arvo Pärt was doing. And they were doing it pretty much at the same time, although Sylvester Roth was doing it first. He was doing it a few years earlier. The quiet songs, I didn't play it for you because I didn't think, it was too much. He started composing this in 1973. Pärt doesn't start doing his tintinnabuli music until 76, 75, right? But they knew one another. They were in communication with one another. And they're very similar in their complete resignation, that's not the right word, their complete abandonment of avant-gardism, right? Or that loud avant-garde dissonance of the 1960s. But they weren't the only ones doing that at the time. I mean, if Ukrainian music of the younger generation is anything, it's probably like the music, if this is what Shmurak's music is like, is that it's eclectic, right? There's this idea that younger composers are using technology in interesting ways, borrowing stylistic tendencies of pop music, rock music, right? And they're part of the millennial sonic soup that's surrounding all of us, and they're trying to digest it in interesting ways. So that would be my response. But clearly there's also issues of nationalism at play in a way that I don't think it is the case for a young American composer. Thanks, it's a good question. All right, thank you.